I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Healthy Aging at Tufts webinar series. Today, we're really privileged to have as our speaker, Dr. Tom Perls, who's a neighbor of ours over at Boston University School of Medicine. Dr. Perls is a professor of medicine in the geriatrics section, and he is also the director of the New England Centenarian study. He works very closely in collaboration with our own Dr. Paolo Sebastiani here at Tufts on these centenarian studies. And Dr. Perls' talk today is entitled, "What is Trending in Exceptional Longevity Studies?" So, Tom, we're so glad you could join us, and I'll turn the floor over to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Roger. It's an honor to be introduced by you. And yeah, you'll see here on the title slide of the talk that I put here with Paolo Sebastiani, who moved from Boston University and now is at Tufts, you lucky guys. And I've been working with her for many years, and I put her here in part so she can answer questions that I can't. But she really runs the statistical analysis piece of all that we do, and is involved in many of the studies that I've listed here that we have been running. The New England Centenarian study is kind of our umbrella that has been going on since 1995, long time. And over the years, as you can imagine, we've garnered a number of studies. Long Life Family Study is a study of 550 families that cluster for exceptional longevity. And I'll explain a little bit about clustering in the talk. And that's been going, those folks were enrolled between 2006 and 2009. It comprises about 5,500 individuals. And has gone through now 4 cycles of funding. And we follow these individuals over time, collecting longitudinal data. The Integrative Longevity Omics Study, the Longevity Consortium Centenarian Project, and a new grant of ours, Resilience and Resistance to Alzheimer's Disease and Centenarians and Their Offspring. I will touch on all of these studies as I go through this talk. So I thought I'd first begin with, what should average life expectancy be? I know that, of course, this is a series on healthy aging, and this speaks a bit to that, and that average life expectancy in the United States, which ranks rather low compared to other high-income countries, I might add, is 77 years for men and 81 years for women. The question is should we be able to do better than that? What should the average be? And I think that this is in part informed by not any of our studies, but the Seventh-day Adventist Health Study run out of Loma Linda University, in which they find in that group of individuals an extraordinary average life expectancy of 86 years for men and 89 years for women. And I guess that begs the question of, who are these Seventh-day Adventists that they're able to muster this kind of average life expectancy? And they're a very mixed group of people when it comes to geography, ethnicity, and race. But their religion does ask that their followers have certain health behaviors, that God has given them this incredible gift of this body, and to do bad things to it is squandering that gift. And so they tend to have some pretty healthy behaviors that are advocated by their religion. They don't smoke, they don't drink alcohol, they generally are vegetarian. I think the important piece of that is that they're avoiding meat. and they tend to eat in moderation. The general rule I have about that is don't eat more than what your hand can cover on a plate. They regularly exercise. They partake in activities that stress religion and family that may help them manage their stress better. And then, though this is not something I see stressed in the Seventh-day Adventists, but I think as long as I'm talking about health-related behaviors that are really important, I would add adequate sleep. There's a really good body of literature to show that that's very helpful as well. And I would say that these 6 behaviors are what is explaining this life expectancy of 86 for men and 89 for women. And that's fairly extraordinary compared to what Americans on average do. So that's what is going on right now. I just thought I would take you back a ways to see what has been going on with average life expectancy and survival over the years, going back as far as the mid 1800s, around when the grandparents of our first centenarians were born. The first centenarians back in the 1990s when we had started this study. And you'll see that about 50% of the population in 1851 was living to about age 45. But as you take that 50% figure out to now, you'll see that in 2011, about 50% are living up to the age of 84. And this is clearly because of major gains made in the 20th century, particularly public health gains, clean water supply, vaccinations, advances in medicine, improved socioeconomic status. That's what's really pushing these curves to up and to the right. And when I say up, that means that they're spending a longer period of their time in good health, and they're compressing the time that they're sick. That's a bit of a different curve. That's called the rectangularization of not just the survival curve, but also the healthy life curve. So people are compressing the time that they're sick towards the end of their lives instead of spending a longer period of time in chronic disability. Now, I'll say also that that's for people who are taking good care of themselves, like the Seventh-day Adventists, where you see that kind of rectangularization. For people who are not taking good care of themselves, they might appear on a lower curve here, where if they're doing things wrong, the opposite of the Seventh-day Adventists, like they're smoking, they're not exercising, they're overweight, then it would make sense that they would have a lower life expectancy and have a longer period of time spent with chronic illness. And that really gets to the next issue of just how much of this average life expectancy is nature versus nurture. And I would say that twin studies, for example, that looked at identical twins reared apart versus reared together, about 70% of how old they were living to be was really based upon differences in their health behaviors based upon whether they were living apart or together. And only 30% would be this baseline genetic makeup that people have. And that just makes great sense, that based upon what I earlier said, based upon what the Seventh-day Adventists are doing, the vast majority of how old people are living to be are based upon these health behaviors. But remember, also in these twin studies, the oldest these individuals were getting to be was in their mid-80s. So when people say that 70% of aging, or they might even unfortunately say longevity or even exceptional longevity is health behaviors, that's not true. It's 70% of the ability to get into your 80s is going to be these differences in health-related behaviors. And that's explaining the variation in life expectancy for people with who, we all have about 99% of our genetic variants are in common, with a relatively small amount of variation explaining the differences between us genetically. At any rate, this map here is another indication of just how important variations in our health behaviors are, where the folks in the red and pink have relatively low life expectancies. The dark red is the low life expectancy below the age of 72. The lighter red is below the age of 75. And this is really rural America, the southeastern United States, where you see a prevalence of these bad behaviors, unfortunately, like more smoking, more obesity, less exercise, more alcoholism, and the socioeconomic status of people are also lower in these areas. So for the purposes of this talk, obviously, yeah, that's getting to age 85, or with the Seventh-day Adventists, age 89 for a woman and age 86 for a man. But what does it take to go the next bunch of years, the next 20, 25, even in the case of some of these individuals and these pictures, 30 or even 35 years more? On the left, upper left is me with a mom and daughter. And the daughters, the children are, of course, in their late 70s and early 80s. And we are following the kids as well as the centenarians. And I'll mention that the kids are very much following in the footsteps of their parents in terms of what appears to be slower aging and a delay or even escape of some aging-related diseases. The middle picture is a photograph of a 106-year-old man. He's holding a certificate from when he was in World War II fighting for Patton's army. And he has all kinds of recognitions for that. And that's his daughter on the left and his son-in-law on the right. And then just yesterday, I was actually even toying with the idea of holding this meeting with this woman here on the right, who I just visited yesterday, and she was just truly remarkable. And she was a little upset with me because we didn't feature her in our last newsletter. And so we thought we'd smooth things over and go visit her. This woman is 111 years old and really very cognitively intact and doing remarkably well. Even I was really quite taken aback by her. And we've known her since 2006. So she's one of the stars of our study. Over on the left is actually on the lower row is a 110-year-old, again with her daughter. That's me, and Rena Karki is the research coordinator for our study. We went out and visited her. In the middle, that picture was taken a long, long time ago. That was in 1998 when we were attending the Gerontological Society of America meeting in Philadelphia. Marjorie Silver, the blonde woman in the front here, who was co-directing the Centenarian study with me at the time, and I looked very different back then. We had enrolled this woman sitting here named Sarah Knaus in our study. She was in Allendale, Pennsylvania. And in this picture, she's 118. And she got to be 119, the second oldest ever in the world, though I will say that there's a person in Japan right now knocking on the door of that record. The oldest ever was Jean Comment, who lived to 122. And then the other investigators here, we all, as I said, were at the Gerontological Society of America meeting, and we got in a big car and took this field trip out to see Ms. Knaus, and these are all some pretty famous people in the area of the demography of aging. And then to the bottom right there, you'll notice the majority here of the centenarians are women, and 85% of centenarians are women. But we do have men in the study, like the one I mentioned before, and then this man here in Dedham, who in this picture was 105 and living by himself. So these different ages have different degrees of rarity associated with them. So if we start, I'm going to improve your nomenclature a little bit. There's different names for these different ages. Octogenarians are people in their 80s, nonagenarians are those in their 90s, centenarians are people 100 and older, but within that group we have people 105 to 109 termed semi-supercentenarians, and then supercentenarians are people, that should be 110 plus, not 100, I'm sorry about that. And you know, octogenarians, as you might guess from what I had mentioned before about at least what Seventh-day Adventists are able to achieve, are fairly common at around 9 million in the United States, about 1 in 30. Nonagenarians there's about 2 million of them in this country, or about 1 in 20 in the population. And centenarians occur about 1 in 5,000 in the population. There's about 70,000 of them. And then the numbers drop off very, very rapidly, so that semi-supercentenarians are about 1 per 250,000 in the population, and supercentenarians are about 1 per 6 million. We have about 2,500 subjects in the study. About a quarter of those are our offspring. The vast majority of the others are going to be the centenarians, age 100 to 103, but we have about 600 semi-supercentenarians in the study and about 200 supercentenarians. These are the largest samples of those individuals in the world. The Japanese have a sample of about 600 individuals, age 105 to 109. And we're working on collaborating with them in some interesting studies that I'll explain. So the main point here is that these ages are rarer and rarer. They're going to be different phenotypes. You can't just lump them all into one group. And as a result, what it takes to become 100 or 101 is probably going to be quite different than what it takes to get to be 105 to 109. And again, what it would take to get to be 110. We study exceptional longevity, but within that are these distinctly different phenotypes. And I guess one of the questions, particularly for the younger folks in the crowd, they might think, well, fine, if you could live to 100, but why would you want to? Because they may think the older you get, the sicker you get, and that as you get to these most extreme ages, people have every age-related disease under the sun and are on death's doorstep. I would say that the photos I showed you speak to quite a different phenomenon, but it really is an optimistic view of aging, in that we fairly early on in our studies realized that about 90% of our centenarians are disability free up through their early 90s. Now, that's not to say they don't have some aging related diseases, but what it does say is if they do have those, they deal with them much better than other people who might otherwise die from them or have a lot of disability associated with them before they pass away at an earlier age. And if you further divide, and so as a result of it, this idea, the older you get, the sicker you get, which was really quite a prevalent dogma that I was dealing with during my training, this work and the work of others have really started to indicate that it's more the case of the older you get, the healthier you've been. And that's the case with even the Seventh-day Adventists, who may not be getting to 100, but they're getting to their older ages because of these healthy behaviors. And as a result, it's not that they're just adding unhealthy years to their lives. Those years are actually healthy years. And then when you look at our 100-year-olds, people who are living to about 100, about 40% of them are what we call survivors. They have aging-related diseases like a small stroke or maybe a small heart attack, or they might have diabetes, high blood pressure. They may have had a history of cancer. But again, they have some kind of resilience that we're trying to figure out how to quantify that, that allows them to still remain disability free up through their 90s, despite having these diseases even before the age of 85. We call them survivors. Then we have these delayers who delay such diseases until after the age of 85, again, still being disability free up through their early 90s. And then we have escapers, those who really don't have much of anything at the age of 100. And I will tell you, for example, those supercentenarians that I showed you in the picture, the two ladies, they were disability free and disease free up through about the average age of about 106. And they were certainly these escapers at age 100. You start to see these are really different phenotypes. And as a result, they're going to have different things in common, or at least different determinants of allowing them to get to these different degrees of survival. So what does it take to live to 100, and why is it so rare? And I know I'm following in the footsteps of Claudio Franceschi, who talked a lot about inflammaging, and those are some very tough shoes to fill, or at least to try and give a talk as good as Claudio's. But I'm going to do my best to try and not repeat much of what he said and cover some different ground. And so I won't talk so much about inflammaging and talk about some other determinants of exceptional longevity. Now, one clue is that the prevalence of centenarians has practically doubled in high-income countries over approximately the past 20 years. And that may indicate, I think, certainly that while about 70–75% of average life expectancy is determined by your health behaviors, the fact that there was a doubling, at least in people getting to about 100 in terms of their prevalence, that would say that there are health behaviors, environmental exposures that still have a pretty big impact. And while it may be 75% to get to your late 80s, it's still going to be a pretty important environmental component to get to about 100. I would say, from what I'm going to tell you in a minute, that genetics starts to play a greater and greater role, but environmental may still be playing, my guess is around 60% will be 60% of the variation in the ability to get to about 100 is still going to be these environmental exposures and health-related behaviors. And what caused this doubling in the prevalence of 100-year-olds? Well, first of all, about a quarter more of the population in the early 1900s was able to survive into adulthood instead of dying during infancy because of clean water supply, more years of education, and better socioeconomic status, and then, of course, vaccinations and improvements in medical care, especially in the 1970s when we started to do a better job of screening high blood pressure and starting to do surgeries, better maternal care, and so on. All those things contributed not to just getting people into their adulthood, but then going from adulthood into late adulthood. There was a big increase in the number of people around 100, but not so much in people getting to 105 to 109 or to 110, which probably says that these major benefits in terms of environmental and health behaviors aren't playing so much of a role here, and that you might be seeing more of a role of genetics getting to these, in the ability to get to these older ages. Another interesting clue is that fairly early on in our studies, we noted that there's pretty significant clustering for true exceptional longevity in families. About 50% of the individuals that we study have some kind of history of exceptional longevity in their family. And it may be that there's more, it's just that people lost their parents to things like infections, accidents, and so on, that had they not had those things at that time in the 1940s or 1950s, who knows, they might have been able to get to these much older ages. So the running in families could be higher than 50%, but we don't know. The other thing to keep in mind also is just because it runs in families doesn't mean that it's all genetic. There's all kinds of health behaviors, whether it be not smoking, diet, the interest in exercise and what have you, that run in families as well, or even being Seventh-day Adventist is something that can run in a family. So just because it runs in families doesn't mean that that there's still an important environmental component. The other thing we noticed, and along those same lines, is that the siblings of centenarians themselves have a much higher risk compared to the average population of getting to these very old ages. And those risks go higher if the proband was at a much older age, 105 or older as well. Then the other point to be made is that I explained to you that among people who are 100, these are really a heterogeneous group with escapers, delayers, and survivors. But when you start getting to these much older ages, 105 and older, they're not so mixed anymore. They're really mostly escapers. And so they're quite phenotypically alike. These are individuals who are not only markedly delaying disability, but they're also delaying, and in some cases escaping, aging-related diseases like Alzheimer's disease, for example. And so that group becomes phenotypically much more alike. And when that happens, you start thinking that you don't need such a huge sample size to start discovering determinants that they have in common, instead of the tens of thousands of individuals that you may need for some of these complex age-related diseases like diabetes and other or heart disease and so on. In this case, we're thinking, 500 to 1,000 individuals, 105 and older, may help you discern factors that they have in common, particularly genetic factors. So a while ago now, as we started to collect genotype data on our subjects, it got to the point that we had about 1,000 individuals in the study, that Dr. Sebastiani and colleagues went ahead and did a genome-wide association study on these individuals. And the average age in this group was around 102, 103, but we did have some individuals getting into into much older age. And, there wasn't any one gene that popped out as being particularly having a strong effect on the ability to get to very old age. Instead, it appeared that that there were a lot of genes that seemed to be associated, but with really modest effects. So then something along the lines of like a polygenic risk score, but a bit different, it was that what Paula did, again with colleagues, is that she would find the genotype that had the strongest association with exceptional longevity, and then find the next one with the next strongest, and so on, and built a genetic signature, if you will, of a group of genetic variants that as you added one to the next, the signature could potentially become better at predicting who was a certain age, like 104, 105, versus who was not. And there got to a point where after you've added enough of these markers, you didn't get much more improvement in the sensitivity of the genetic signature to pick somebody out. And so she actually developed this graph, this table or figure shows that in building these genetic signatures at the younger ages, at about age 95 or so, you only had a little bit better than chance to say that a particular signature was good at indicating here's a 95-year-old. But what you did find is that with the older and older individuals, the genetic signatures that she built became better and better at indicating that this indeed, if you had a bowl full of these signatures and you pulled one out, and it was one that you knew was associated with living to be 106 or so, you had about an 85% sensitivity or accuracy of being right, which is really a phenomenal accuracy. But on the other hand, I will also say that a signature like that is exceptionally rare, and it wouldn't pay for anybody to try and get their genotyping done and see what signature they have, because the chances would be incredibly small, like the chances of seeing a supercentenarian at 1 per 6 million. It'd be like winning the lottery of you having the signature that would say you're going to be that age. I hope I explained that okay, and that Paula's not having a seizure right now. Now, the fact that there are about 130 different genes that make up a signature like that makes a lot of sense, because there are many different mechanisms that are probably playing roles in how well we age. And each of those mechanisms is going to have a range of genetic variants that are playing a role in these mechanisms. And so there's going to be lots and lots of genes, and Paula's work bears that out. And this is a table that a figure that's really quite famous in gerontology pictures, circles, that was developed by Lopez Oten in 2013. He came up with something similar more recently that really looks at metabolomics in particular. And I just would refer all of you to take a closer look at this when you want to learn more about proposed different mechanisms of aging. The other thing I wanted to mention is, what kind of genes are we talking about here? Because early on we thought, well, it must be that centenarians lack a bunch of disease genes. And if you had those disease genes, you're not going to get to 100. Apolipoprotein E4 is a famous one. And in fact, the frequency of that is quite low in centenarians, but it's also quite low at younger ages. And if you look at genetic signatures, and E4 is in there, if you take that E4 out of the signature, in terms of its sensitivity for being able to predict a person living to these very old ages, the sensitivity changes very, very little. So if it does play a role, it's a pretty tiny role. It would seem that you probably shouldn't have some variants that are well known, like for Huntington's chorea and what have you, these monogenic disease variants. But generally speaking, our study and a couple of other studies indicate that that these centenarians have just about the same frequencies as the general population of these disease variants. So that's probably not so important here in terms of having a decreased rate of these disease variants. What does seem to be important is that they probably have protective variants, variants that counter the effects of the disease variants that are common, as well as other variants that actually slow down aging and decrease your risk for aging-related diseases. This is a list of some of the main genes that people have been focusing on lately. I'm not going to get too much into what each of these do. And there are certainly others as well, but they keep popping up in some animal studies. They pop up in some of the centenarian studies as well, and looking at some specific diseases associated with aging, like Alzheimer's disease. And so we're really getting quite interested in these specific variants, but probably even more important are the biological mechanisms that groups of variants are going to point to, and some of which were highlighted in that figure about disease mechanisms I showed you before. So if, let me just check what time it is here. Roger, how much time do I have left?
You're good if you took 5 to 8 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So what I wanted to also mention is, if you're going to say that there are protective genes, I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, what would be the selection pressure that would cause the selection of such genes? I mean, in the past, we always thought the selection pressure pretty much stops after reproduction. And as we certainly see that in lower organisms. And so if that's the case, what is the reason that we live 30, 40 years beyond the age at which reproduction stops, and what would be the selection pressure for the development of such genes. And we had done another study that helps inform that. And that was a study that we had titled Middle-Aged Mothers Live Longer, in which we had found that a substantial number of our centenarian women had had children after the age of 40. About 20% of them, in fact, had children after the age of 40 compared to about 5% in the general population. Over 40% had children, over 50% had children after the age of 35. This was before, fertility assistance, things like taking fertility drugs, but this was just natural childbirth. And thinking about that, we thought, well, that would kind of make sense. If you're aging slowly, your reproductive system is aging slowly, and therefore maybe you're able to have kids at later age. You have decreased risk for aging-related diseases that would impact upon fertility. And so we started to make this connection between what might be going on with the reproductive system and general aging. And I just want to put one other concept out here that is necessary to think about when thinking about reproduction, and that is, why does menopause occur? Which is pretty tightly controlled. It occurs around age 52 for the most part, including in our centenarians. We think it's a little hard to go ask women how old they were when they went through menopause, which would have about 50 years earlier, but it's around 52 on average. And what's interesting is that menopause really doesn't occur in other mammals. The age at which the lifespan, the ages at which mammals pass away, is around the time that they stop reproducing. And I think there's a reason why humans are so different, and it has to do with this developing a bipedal posture where we walk on 2 instead of 4 limbs. There's a picture of a chimpanzee on the left. In fact, chimpanzees' arms are longer than their legs. They don't stand up, except a little bit, but they don't walk around like humans do. And when humans evolved this standing up posture, walking on just on their feet, the shape of the pelvis greatly changed. Where instead of it being, here's on the right, a picture, for example, a sheep, of the relation of the uterus to the pelvis, and the birth canal is basically straight, and it takes very little effort to push the offspring out, and there's very little mortality associated with bearing young in non-human mammals. But with the erect posture, the shape of the birth canal became a dangerous hairpin question mark shaped birth canal. And with that, as the women who've had children will tell you, it means pushing that baby out is very, very difficult. And there's significant mortality risk associated with that to both baby and mother. And as you get older, it becomes more and more difficult for a woman to do that, to the point that she becomes so frail that the mortality risk becomes untenable. And so it would make sense that mutations would occur that would cause menopause and stop you from having children at very old age when you're frail and when you could die, and instead stop reproducing, take care of the young that you've already had, and allow them to get to reproductive age, and maybe even allow you to go on to be a grandparent if you have, and then be able to take care of your grandkids while the parents go off and do more laborious work. That's called the grandparent hypothesis. But this is really the, we think, a what's called the adaptive hypothesis of menopause. So given that there's this pretty much stop point for when you can have children, there was probably a point when, with frailty, as we were evolving occurring in your 20s and 30s, it might make sense that if you could prolong the period of time that you had children, you could have more of them, and perhaps selecting for genes that would slow down the aging of the reproductive system and decrease your risk for aging-related diseases that impact upon fertility. This could be a selection pressure for developing longevity variants that would get women to be able to have kids into their 30s and then in some cases even into their 40s. Of course, those genes don't just stop working after menopause, and you can have this long period of time post-menopause of people surviving into their 80s, 90s, and later. So that's to get the reproductive system aging slowly, but that also means the rest of us might be aging more slowly as well. And it's interesting to then think about where are all the genes that are doing this. And of course, there's many genes on the X chromosome involved in the health of the reproductive system. There's genes on there like DNA repair genes and so on that are probably important for aging more slowly. So it really, it's been a real challenge to look at X chromosome genetics in GWAS, but the hope is with whole genome sequencing and other analytic methods, we can do a better job of looking at potential protective genes on the X chromosome. I'm almost done. I wanted to end with a really important area, and that is, I've spoken mostly about whites. And if you look at, if you look at cohort life tables, about 2.5% of women at around at birth go on to live to be 100, and about 0.9% of white men do so. But it's very interesting that the same for Hispanic women, about 6% go on to be 100, and 2.2% of men. And in between are Blacks. Now, of course, life expectancy is less for Blacks, but at some point, if they survive it beyond age in their late 70s, likely, they become a select survivor cohort and are more likely to get to these older ages than the whites. And I didn't realize this, but the CDC does not give you these statistics for Asians. And I had to go look at the data from Japan and from Hong Kong, where the rates are really quite striking. In Hong Kong, 10% of born women go on to be 100, which again speaks to this notion that it's really quite more common, and that genetics may be playing a little bit less of a role, and other health behaviors that may be more common in Asians could be really important. Or in fact, there may be something genetically going on that predisposes Asians to do better in getting to 100 than whites. And along those same lines, Hispanics are doing better than whites and Blacks. All of this is to say that our studies have to do a much, much better job of enrolling these different groups and comparing and contrasting them to better inform us about the factors that get us to these older ages. And that's what we're really working hard on right now. Roger, with that, I'm done. And I'm sorry I went a little longer than I should have.
No, thank you very much, Tom, for an excellent presentation, some really stimulating areas for questions, and particularly the issues on race there as well, and diversity. So thank you. Okay, folks, we now have time for questions. If people want to submit their questions into the Q&A, that's the best thing to do. Occasionally people submit to the chat, but if we can do the Q&A, that would be ideal. Maybe I'll just start off with a question that might be obvious, but worth asking, I think, is how are your centenarian cohorts doing during the pandemic, and sort of, what has been sort of the profile of COVID-19 in your cohorts?
Yeah, interestingly, there's some evidence in at least one short letter that I saw of, particularly in Europe, folks were looking at centenarians and found that they were faring quite well compared to younger elderly. And this speaks to some pretty amazing immune systems that I know that Claudio alluded to or spoke in depth about. And I think there is this select survivor cohort phenomenon going on that certainly we lost centenarians, and those who were going to pass away at 101 and being very frail at that point, it might have succumbed to COVID. But there is I think, a strong group here.
Great. So here's a question from Alan Taylor saying, looking at the race and assessing age-related disease rather than age, do you see the same relationships? So I guess this is related to the prevalence of age-related diseases in the different racial groups that you studied, that you reported on.
Well, when you look at averages, right? So the African Americans, for example, they develop high blood pressure sooner, and as a result, heart disease and stroke, because of worse socioeconomic conditions, worse access to healthcare, and so on. And they're going to get these things sooner. But then again, there's this select cohort that if there's a group that don't get those things, and then there's going to be more of them that are going to go on to be 100. The Hispanics, interestingly, are more predisposed to diabetes and hypertension, and may develop those things sooner as well on average. But then again, there's going to be the select cohort that don't get those things who seem to do better. I hope I
that's it's a really interesting point. And I guess, and Paula was wondering if maybe you could describe some of the ongoing efforts to actually find more centenarians that are from underrepresented minority populations, because I think that is going to be important, because I'm sure looking at their genotypes and phenotypes will be really revealing.
That is not the first time I've heard Paula ask that question. She's been asking for a while and has been very strongly pushing it. She and her team actually have noticed for quite some time major differences according to race, the effects of specific genotypes like the ApoE2 and ApoE4. And the only way she's going to really be able to study these is if we give her a lot more subjects from these different groups. And I think we're finding our greatest success, and what I've learned recently from a colleague that's going to help us recruit and enroll a lot more Asians into our studies, particularly Chinese, is voter registration lists. And then particularly for the Chinese, doing recruitment that uses Cantonese and Mandarin research assistants and literature and recruitment materials. And in other populations, being much more culturally sensitive and sensitive to specific issues helps a lot too. But voter registration lists, I think, are very, very helpful in the United States.
Great, great. Mitch McVeigh from over in our biology department asks, a 2021 Italian study suggested that exceptional, excuse me, that exceptional DNA repair capacity and clonal hematopoiesis are characteristics of supercentenarians. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, we are seeing that. Well, I might defer a little to Paula about the clonal hematopoiesis, who actually is working on that. With regard to I'm not aware of the DNA repair findings in the supercentenarians. There's very little known about these extreme ages, and that's why we're madly trying to amass a large enough sample. We're also getting iPS cell lines from these individuals to be able to study something like that as well. I think that's more of a hypothesis than it is a demonstrated finding. And Paula, do you want to say anything about clonal hematopoiesis?
But one thing to we have one of our students who's been working on this for a couple of years, and one result that we see is that in the past there was the projection that as people get older and older, the number of somatic mutations keep increasing, going up and up. But what we see is a different story, is that actually to really live to extreme old ages, the prevalence of individuals with somatic mutation goes down. So there is really a curvature effect, a plateau, and then these projections don't seem to be valid. But one is also to say that technology for the identification of somatic mutation is not perfect yet. So it's a mix between the good data and possibly bad data. So we are trying to navigate this.
So is there and sort of do those people actually have fewer cancers, the supercentenarians? You know, if they have less somatic mutations, I mean, is there some cancer relationship even in that group?
There very much is.
Okay.
We've written a couple of papers now. One of the very interesting things also, besides a decreased rate of cancer, is that among those who do develop cancer, these tend to end up being really quite large tumors that don't metastasize. They have these very slow growing tumors that become quite large, and trying to understand the underpinnings of why they don't go on to metastasize. If they have, it ties in closely perhaps with Claudio's studies on and the inflammatory system's ability to keep these cancers at bay. Certainly complicated, but we're really interested in the interaction between cancer and extreme longevity.
And then interesting question from Dr. Xiaoquang Lai. You know, this is I think a good one. What is the relationship between sort of retirement age and longevity? In other words, do people live longer if they stay active and engaged in their employment, or is there any relationship there?
Well, there's of course the confounder, right, where people who retire because of illness and what have you, we don't know, and it depends upon what your retirement entails. As a geriatrician, I'll say if your retirement means that you're going to go on and do all the things you've always wanted to do, that you're being cognitively active, you're doing all kinds of different things, all those kind of activities are associated with longevity, with healthy aging. If on the other hand, it means you're not going to do those things, you're going to slow down and not exercise, not take care of yourself, well, then retirement is not going to be associated with better aging.
Great. And let's just end with this. We're just about over time here, and I'm respectful for people's time. And this is a great seminar, Tom. But what
I wish I had stopped sooner because they're
No.
great questions.
that's
sorry.
fine. No, that's fine. But what is the common cause of death among the centenarians that you study? What does sort of
It still is the common things in older people. It's going to be heart attack and then immunosenescence, like what Claudia talked about with pneumonia. It's just that it's all greatly delayed and pushed to the end.
Very interesting. So I'd like to thank again, Dr. Perls, for a really stimulating topic about exceptional longevity and the centenarian studies that they're doing. Thank you all for joining us at today's seminar. And our next seminar is next month. And we'll look forward to you attending that as well. So thank you all very much for your attendance today. And thank you again, Tom. It's a great talk.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much.